Hello everyone. In today's video, I will share with you an impactful story that will deeply challenge your beliefs and make you question everything you've ever heard about God and what religions tell us. We're going to meet Delilah Marlowe, a woman who, after a near-death experience, discovered an unimaginable truth about what God really is. What she experienced on the other side will leave you speechless and reveal something that religions have never told. Before we begin, go ahead and leave a like. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any transformative content like this, and activate the notification bell to receive all updates. Now, get ready for this intense and revealing journey. My name is Delilah Marlowe, and I'm here to share a story that completely changed my life. A story that, for many, may seem impossible or even madness. But for me, it is the deepest truth I've ever experienced. I was born and raised in a family where success was the only currency that mattered. My parents, though loving in their own way, had monumental expectations for me. My mother used to say that being average was not an option in our family. My father, on the other hand, expressed his love through constant pressure to be the best at everything I did. From an early age, I learned that love and acceptance came with achievements. In school, I was always at the top of the class, the girl who got the highest grades in every subject. I participated in every extracurricular activity possible, from the debate club to the swim team. Externally, I was the model of perfection that my parents so desired. But internally, I was falling apart. Each achievement, each trophy, each top grade was just another weight on my already overloaded shoulders. I lived with a constant fear of failure, of disappointing others, of not being good enough. The emptiness inside me grew every day, and nothing I did seemed to fill it. When I entered college, I thought things might change. After all, it was a fresh start, away from the watchful eyes of my parents. But the pressure I had internalized over the years didn't magically disappear. On the contrary, it seemed to take on a life of its own inside me. It was during this time that I discovered what seemed like an escape valve: parties and alcohol. For the first time in my life, I could relax, let go of all those suffocating expectations. At parties, I wasn't Delilah the perfectionist, the girl who had to be the best at everything. I was just me, or at least that's what I thought at the time. Little did I know that this would be the beginning of a downward spiral that would take me to rock bottom. But it would also be the path that would lead me to the most transformative experience of my life. An experience that would teach me the true meaning of love, acceptance, and purpose. This is my story. The story of how I died, literally, in order to truly live. What began as occasional relief soon turned into a dangerous habit. Weekend parties became nightly outings during the week. Alcohol, which once gave me a sense of freedom, was now a necessity just to get through the day. I still maintained high grades and my image as an exemplary student, but inside, I was disintegrating. The emptiness I felt grew bigger and bigger, and alcohol was no longer enough to fill it. That's when drugs entered the scene. It started with something that seemed harmless. A friend offered me a joint at a party, saying it would help me relax even more. And it did. For the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe without the weight of the world on my shoulders. But, like alcohol, that relief was temporary and increasingly insufficient. Soon, I was experimenting with harder drugs. Cocaine became my constant companion. I used it to study, to party, to simply get through the day. My life became a constant search for the next high, the next dose that would make me feel something beyond the emptiness and anxiety that consumed me. My relationships began to deteriorate. Friends who cared tried to intervene, but I pushed them away. My family, always so present and demanding, now seemed distant. I constantly lied, making up excuses for my erratic behavior and withdrawal. My body also began to show signs of wear. I lost weight, my skin became pale, and dark circles formed under my eyes. But I ignored all the signs, convinced I had everything under control. As my addiction deepened, my world grew smaller and smaller. My days revolved around getting money for drugs, using drugs and recovering enough to repeat the cycle. I had become a stranger to myself, a shadow of the ambitious and vibrant girl I once was. Rock bottom was approaching quickly, but I was too blind to see it. I continued on this self-destructive path, convinced it was the only way to cope with the pressure and expectations that had suffocated me since childhood. I didn't know it at the time, but I was about to have an encounter with destiny that would change everything. A night that would start like so many others, but lead me on a journey beyond the boundaries of life and death. It was a Friday night in New York, a city that never sleeps, where secrets hide in the shadows of skyscrapers. I found myself in an underground club in the heart of Manhattan, a place where the lights flickered in a frantic rhythm and the music pulsed so loudly that it made my chest vibrate. The air was thick, a mixture of cigarette smoke, sweat, and despair disguised as fun. I had been there for hours, my body moving to the rhythm of the music, but my mind wandering to a distant place. I had consumed a considerable amount of alcohol and a few lines of cocaine, but it still wasn't enough. It never was. That's when a familiar face emerged from the crowd. It was Jake, a casual acquaintance I would run into at these parties. He approached, shouting something I could barely hear over the deafening noise. His eyes gleamed with an intensity I recognized well, the relentless pursuit of the next high. Jake grabbed my hand and pulled me into a darker corner of the club. He pulled out a small bag from his pocket, filled with a white powder that sparkled under the strobe lights. "This will make you fly," he shouted in my ear, a crooked smile on his face. Without hesitation, I took the bag. At that moment, I didn't care to ask what exactly it was. All I wanted was to escape, to feel something other than the emptiness that consumed me. With trembling hands, I prepared a line on the back of a credit card. When I inhaled the powder, I immediately knew something was wrong. The sensation was unlike anything I had experienced before. Instead of the familiar euphoria, I felt as though my body was burning from the inside. My heart began to beat so fast that I thought it would explode in my chest. The world around me started spinning, the club lights blending into a blur of colors. I tried to grab onto something, anything, but my legs wouldn't respond. I felt panic rising inside me as my vision began to darken at the edges. I tried to scream for help, but no sound came out. It was as if my entire body was shutting down, system by system. The last thing I remember was falling to the floor, the dull thud of my body hitting the ground muffled by the loud music. And then, darkness. A deep and absolute darkness that seemed to swallow everything. For a moment, I thought this was the end, that I had finally crossed the line, and there was no turning back. But I was wrong. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of a journey that would change my life forever. The moment my body hit the club floor, something extraordinary happened. It was as if an electric current passed through me, and suddenly, I felt an indescribable lightness. The pain, the panic, the suffocation, it all disappeared in an instant. I opened my eyes, or at least I thought I had, and found myself floating above my own body. It was a surreal feeling, as if I were watching a scene from a movie. There I was, lying on the floor, pale and motionless, while the people around me were panicking. I saw Jake, the guy who had given me the drug, running through the crowd. Other people knelt beside me, shouting for help. Someone started doing chest compressions on me. It was strange to see my own body being handled like that, but I felt nothing. No pain, no discomfort. I wanted to shout to them that I was fine, that I was right above them, but no sound came out. I then realized I no longer had a physical mouth to speak or ears to hear. However, I could perceive everything around me with astonishing clarity. The sounds of the club, which had been deafening before, now seemed distant and muffled. The flashing lights no longer bothered me. It was as if all my senses had fused into a single amplified perception. I looked at my hands, or what I thought were my hands, and saw that they were made of a sort of translucent light. My entire body seemed to be composed of this same luminous energy. As I watched the scene below, I felt a deep peace envelop me. All the fears, anxieties, and pressures that had tormented me for so long simply dissipated. For the first time in years, I felt truly free. But along with that peace came an overwhelming understanding. I saw my life flash before my eyes, not as a quick movie, but as a series of crystal clear moments. I saw the choices I had made, the paths I had taken, and the opportunities I had wasted. I saw the love from my parents, which I had interpreted as pressure. I saw friends who had tried to help me and whom I had pushed away. I felt a deep sadness for having reached this point, for having wasted so much. But it wasn't a desperate sadness. It was more like a compassionate understanding, a gentle acceptance of who I was and what I had done. As I reflected on all this, I felt a soft force pulling me upward. It was as if an immense magnet was drawing me away from the club, the city, the world I had known. I looked one last time at my body on the floor. The paramedics had arrived and were frantically working to revive me. For a moment, I hesitated. Should I go back? Try again? But the force pulling me was irresistible. With a mixture of fear and anticipation, I surrendered to it. And so, I began my journey beyond the limits of the physical world, toward an unknown yet strangely welcoming destination. As I moved further away from the club, the scene below grew smaller and smaller. The lights of Manhattan, which had once seemed so bright and vibrant, now looked like tiny points in the darkness. It was as if I were ascending, but not in a physical way. It was more like I was expanding, becoming part of something much larger. The darkness around me began to change. It was no longer the absence of light, but rather a void full of potential. I began to see colors I had never seen before, colors for which I have no name. They were vibrant and alive, pulsing with their own energy. As I traveled through this indefinable space, I began to sense a presence. It wasn't something I could see or touch, but it was as real as anything I had ever experienced. It was a feeling of not being alone, of being guided, and then I saw it. On what seemed to be the horizon of this vast space, a light began to appear. At first, it was just a tiny point, no bigger than a distant star. But as I got closer, or it came closer to me, I can't say for sure, the light grew larger and brighter. The glow was intense, stronger than anything I had ever seen. But surprisingly, it didn't hurt my eyes. In fact, it was comforting, welcoming. It was as if this light was calling me, inviting me to come closer. As I moved toward the light, I began to hear something. It wasn't exactly sound, at least not as we know it. It was more like music, but music made of emotions and memories. I could feel love, joy, sadness, all mixed into an indescribable symphony. As I got closer, the light took shape. It wasn't just a uniform glow, but rather a kaleidoscope of constantly changing colors and patterns. It was as if it were alive, pulsing with an energy that I could feel resonating through my being. I felt an irresistible pull toward this light. It wasn't a physical force pulling me, but a deep, almost primordial desire to merge with it. It was as if, for the first time in my life, I was truly heading home. As I drew nearer, I realized that the light had no defined boundary. It extended infinitely, enveloping everything around it, and then, without any sensation of movement, I was within it. The feeling was indescribable. It was like being embraced by all the love in the universe at once. Every cell of my being, if I still had cells in this form, vibrated with pure, powerful energy. All the worries, fears, and pains I had ever felt simply dissolved. In that moment, I understood. I understood that this light, this energy, was the source of everything. It was the unconditional love that permeates all of existence. It was God, but not the God I had imagined in my childhood. It wasn't a distant, judgmental figure, but a loving, omnipresent presence. While immersed in this light, I began to have visions. I saw my entire life, not as a series of linear events, but as a whole, interconnected. I saw how every choice I made, every person I met, every experience I had served a purpose. Even the most painful and difficult moments were part of a greater plan. I also saw beyond my own life. I saw the interconnectedness of all things, how every action affects the whole. I understood that we are not separate from each other or from the universe. We are all part of a grand cosmic tapestry. In that state of total understanding, I felt a deep peace. All the judgments I had about myself and others simply vanished. I understood that there are no mistakes, only lessons. That each soul is on its own journey of growth and evolution. Time had no meaning in this place. It could have been a second or an eternity. It was impossible to say. I wanted to stay there forever, bathed in this light of infinite love and understanding. But then, gently, I felt I was being called back. A voice, and which wasn't really a voice but more like a shared thought, told me, "It's not your time yet. You have more to do." Part of me wanted to resist, to stay in this state of ecstasy and total understanding. But deep down, I knew that this voice was right. My journey on Earth was not yet over. With a mixture of reluctance and acceptance, I felt myself beginning to separate from the light. But as I moved away, I realized that I wasn't truly leaving the light behind. It was now a part of me, and I would carry this understanding back with me. I began my journey back, knowing that the life I would return to would never be the same. The transition back to the physical world was as sudden as the departure. One moment I was immersed in the divine light, and the next, I felt a violent pull and found myself back in my body. It felt like being forced into a suit that was too tight and uncomfortable. I opened my eyes, and the first thing I saw was the worried face of a paramedic. The club lights, which had seemed so vibrant before, were now blinding and painful. The sounds around me were a frightening cacophony after the peaceful silence I had experienced. "She's back," I heard someone shout. I tried to speak, but my throat was dry and sore. My chest hurt, probably from the chest compressions. Every breath was an effort, as if I had forgotten how to do something as basic as breathing. I was quickly placed on a stretcher and taken to the ambulance. The entire ride to the hospital was a blur of sirens, flashing lights, and worried voices. I wanted to tell them I was okay, that I had experienced something incredible, but the words wouldn't come. At the hospital, I underwent a series of tests. The doctors were perplexed. Technically, I had been dead for several minutes. My heart had stopped beating, and my brain had been deprived of oxygen for a period that should have caused irreversible damage. Yet, there I was, alive and seemingly without any neurological aftereffects. While the doctors discussed my case, trying to find medical explanations for what had happened, I remained silent. How could I explain to them what I had experienced? How could I describe the feeling of being enveloped in pure and unconditional love? How could I convey the deep understanding I had gained about the nature of existence? In the days that followed, I received visitors. My parents arrived, their faces marked by fear and concern. Friends whom I had pushed away came by, offering support. Everyone wanted to know what had happened, how I was feeling. But how could I explain that? Despite my aching and exhausted body, I felt more alive than ever. How could I say that the near-death experience had actually been the most profound experience of life I had ever had? As I recovered physically, I struggled internally with the contrast between the reality I had experienced and the world around me. The hospital, with its white walls and the smell of disinfectant, felt so limited, so small compared to the vastness I had encountered. When I was finally discharged, I returned home with a mix of emotions. On one hand, I was grateful to have been given a second chance. On the other, I felt a deep nostalgia for the peace and understanding I had experienced on the other side. I knew I had returned for a reason, that I still had a purpose to fulfill in this life. But I also knew that the path ahead would not be easy. How could I return to my old life after what I had lived through? How could I integrate that transcendent experience into my everyday existence? These questions echoed in my mind as I took the first steps into my new life, a life forever transformed by my journey beyond the limits of death. The first days after returning home were a whirlwind of conflicting emotions and sensations. On the outside, I seemed to be the same Delilah as always. My body was recovering quickly, with no visible signs of the trauma I had endured. But inside, I was a completely different person. The experience I had beyond life had fundamentally changed my perception of reality. The world around me, which once seemed so solid and definitive, now appeared to be a fragile illusion. I knew there was so much more beyond what our eyes can see, much more than our limited minds can comprehend. This new perspective brought with it unexpected challenges. Simple daily tasks, which I used to do without thinking, now seemed strange and meaningless. How could I worry about bills or cleaning the house when I had experienced the vastness of the universe and the unconditional love of God? My relationships were also affected. Friends and family, though relieved at my recovery, couldn't understand the depth of the change I had undergone. When I tried to share my experience, I was met with confused or skeptical looks. Some suggested that what I had experienced was merely a dream or a hallucination caused by the lack of oxygen to the brain. This skepticism hurt me deeply. How could they doubt something that, to me, was more real than anything I had ever lived? Gradually, I learned to keep my experience to myself, sharing it only with those who showed a genuine openness to listen. But the greatest challenge was internal. The peace and understanding I had experienced on the other side seemed to grow more distant as the days passed. The contrast between that transcendent reality and everyday life was painful. I often found myself longing to return, yearning for the light and love I had felt. This desire to return to the other side brought with it a dangerous temptation. Part of me considered the idea of trying to recreate the experience through drugs. After all, wasn't it an overdose that had taken me there the first time? But something inside me knew that this was not the way. The experience I had was sacred, not something that could be artificially recreated. Besides, I knew I had returned for a reason. I had a purpose to fulfill, even though I still didn't know exactly what it was. To waste this second chance would be a betrayal not only to myself, but to the greater force that had sent me back. Gradually, I began to realize that the true challenge wasn't to relive the experience I had, but rather to bring the essence of that experience into my daily life. How could I live in a way that honored what I had learned? How could I manifest that unconditional love I'd experienced in my everyday interactions? These questions led me on a journey of self-discovery and transformation. I began to seek ways to integrate my spiritual experience into my practical life. Meditation, spiritual studies, volunteer work, I explored various paths in an attempt to reconnect with that sense of unity and purpose. The process was difficult and often frustrating. There were days when I felt completely lost, as if I were living between two worlds without truly belonging to either of them. But there were also moments of clarity, glimpses of the greater truth I had experienced, which gave me the strength to keep going. Slowly, I began to understand that integration wasn't something that would happen overnight. It was a journey, a continuous process of learning and growth. And this journey, as challenging as it was the true purpose for which I had returned. As the months passed, I began to notice significant changes in myself and in how I interacted with the world around me. The transformation that had started during my near-death experience continued to unfold, affecting every aspect of my life. One of the most notable changes was regarding my old addictions. The desire for drugs and alcohol, which had once seemed uncontrollable, simply vanished. It wasn't a matter of willpower or constant struggle. It was as if the need to escape, to seek something outside of myself, had been completely fulfilled by the experience I had. My perception of time also changed drastically. Before, I had constantly lived in the future, always anxious about the next goal, the next achievement. Now, I found a deep appreciation for the present moment. Every breath, every interaction, every sensory experience became a source of wonder and gratitude. My relationships underwent an equally profound transformation. The understanding of the interconnectedness of all things that I had experienced translated into unprecedented compassion and empathy. I could see beyond appearances and superficial behaviors, recognizing the divine light in every person I encountered. This led to surprising reconciliations. I forgave my parents for all the pressure they had placed on me, understanding that they, too, were on their own journey of learning. I reconnected with friends I had pushed away during my years of addiction, asking for forgiveness and offering understanding. My relationship with work and success also underwent a complete overhaul. The frantic pursuit of external achievements that had defined much of my previous life no longer made sense. Instead, I began to seek a deeper purpose, a way to positively contribute to the world around me. This led me to make drastic changes in my career. I left my high-paying corporate job to dedicate myself to social work. I began working with at-risk youth, sharing my story and helping them find a path away from drugs and self-destruction. My near-death experience also awakened in me a deep interest in spirituality and the metaphysical. I began studying different religious and philosophical traditions, seeking to better understand what I had experienced. Meditation, yoga, and contemplative practices became an integral part of my daily life. However, this transformation wasn't always easy or linear. There were days when I felt lost, when everyday reality seemed oppressive compared to the expansion I had experienced. There were moments of doubt when I questioned whether it had all been just an elaborate illusion created by my brain in crisis. But then, in the most unexpected moments, I would catch glimpses of that greater reality. It could be during a particularly beautiful sunset, in a moment of deep connection with another person, or simply in the quiet of meditation. In those moments, I would once again feel that loving presence, that understanding that everything is interconnected. These glimpses reminded me that the transformation wasn't about constantly trying to recreate the transcendent experience I had. It was about bringing the essence of that experience, the love, the compassion, the understanding of the unity of all things, into my everyday life. Gradually, I began to understand that my near-death experience had not been an end in itself, but the beginning of a much greater journey, a journey of continuous growth, expansion of consciousness, and service to others. I realized that each day brought new opportunities to apply the lessons I had learned. Every interaction was a chance to manifest that unconditional love I had experienced. Every challenge was an invitation to practice acceptance and trust in the flow of life. This transformation didn't mean I had become perfect or that I had all the answers. Far from it. I still faced struggles, still made mistakes, still had moments of doubt and fear. But the difference was that now I saw these experiences not as obstacles, but as opportunities for growth. The biggest change, perhaps at occurs, was in my relationship with death. The fear of death, which had once loomed like a shadow over my life, had completely disappeared. I knew, deep within my being, that death was not the end, but merely a transition. This understanding gave me incredible freedom to live fully, to embrace each moment with gratitude and joy. As time went on, I felt an increasingly strong calling to share my experience with others. It wasn't a desire for attention or recognition, but a deep conviction that my story could bring hope and comfort to those struggling with fear, doubt, or a loss of meaning in life. I began modestly, sharing my story in small support groups for people who had gone through similar experiences. It was surprising to discover how many people had had near-death experiences, but were afraid to talk about them for fear of judgment or ridicule. In these groups, I found a community of people who understood what I had gone through. We shared our stories, our struggles to integrate our experiences into daily life, and the profound transformations we had undergone. These connections were incredibly healing and empowering. Gradually, I started accepting invitations to speak at larger events, spirituality conferences, university lectures, even some television programs. Each time I shared my story, I was amazed by the response from people. Many would cry, feeling touched by something they couldn't fully explain. Others expressed deep relief, as if my experience confirmed something they had always felt but could never articulate. Of course, not all reactions were positive. I encountered my fair share of skeptics and critics. Some tried to discredit my experience, labeling it as a hallucination or fantasy. Instead of arguing or trying to convince, I learned to simply offer my story as it was, allowing each person to draw their own conclusions. One of the most rewarding parts of sharing my experience was seeing how it inspired positive changes in people's lives. I received messages from individuals who had given up addictions, reconciled broken relationships, or found a new sense of purpose after hearing my story. These messages constantly reminded me of why I had come back. As my platform grew, I felt a greater responsibility. I didn't want people to see me as some kind of guru or special figure. I constantly emphasized that my experience didn't make me better or wiser than anyone else. It was simply a window into a reality that is available to all of us if we choose to open our hearts and minds. I began to see my role not as someone who had all the answers, but as a facilitator. My goal was to create spaces where people could explore their own spiritual experiences, question their limiting beliefs, and discover their own potential for unconditional love and compassion. This journey of sharing my story took me to places I could never have imagined. I traveled the world, met people from all walks of life and beliefs, and saw firsthand how the desire for spiritual connection and meaning transcends all cultural and religious barriers. But most importantly, it was a constant reminder of the love and wisdom I had experienced and a call to keep living in alignment with those truths. Now, years after that fateful night in the New York club, I look back and barely recognize the person I once was. The journey since then has been extraordinary, full of challenges, growth, and a continuous expansion of consciousness that I could never have predicted. My near-death experience was, without a doubt, the most transformative event of my life. It not only saved me from a path of self-destruction, but also opened my eyes to a reality far more vast and beautiful than I could ever have imagined. However, I've realized that the true transformation didn't happen at the moment of the experience itself, but in the ongoing work of integrating that experience into my daily life. Every day is an opportunity to remember and live by the truths I discovered. That we are all deeply loved and interconnected. That there is a greater purpose to all our experiences, and that death is not something to be feared. One of the most important lessons I've learned is that we don't need to have a near-death experience to access this wisdom. The truth I experienced is available to all of us at any moment. It's in the quiet moments, in acts of kindness, in the beauty of nature, in deep connection with others. It's in the love we give and receive every day. Today, I see my life as an ongoing mission. It's not just about sharing my story, but living in a way that inspires others to connect with their own divine essence. Every interaction is an opportunity to spread love. Every challenge a chance to practice compassion and acceptance. I don't claim to have all the answers. In fact, the more I learn, the more I realize how much there is still to discover. The spiritual journey is infinite, always inviting us to expand our understanding and our capacity to love. If there's one message I would like to leave for those who read my story, it's this: you are loved unconditionally, exactly as you are. You are part of something far greater than you can imagine. Your life has a purpose, even if you can't always clearly see what it is. And every moment is an opportunity to choose love, to grow, to become more than you were before. My near-death experience showed me that life is precious and that every moment is a gift. We don't need to wait for a dramatic experience to start living fully. We can choose, here and now, to open our hearts, to forgive, to love unconditionally, and to live with gratitude and purpose. As I continue my journey, I am deeply grateful for every day, every experience, every person who crosses my path. I know that one day I will return to that light of unconditional love, but until then, my mission is to bring as much of that light into this world as I can, one moment at a time. And for you, who has read my story this far, my hope is that it has touched something within you, that it has sparked a curiosity, an openness to explore the depths of your own being. Remember, you are light, you are love, and you have the power to transform your life and the world around you, one act of love at a time. If you enjoyed this beautiful spiritual testimony, leave a like, share your thoughts in the comments, subscribe to the channel, and don't forget to activate the notification bell so you can watch every new video and help us spread this message to more people. See you next time.